And thanks
There
for
you
taking the
go.
time, Greg. Again, thanks for your offer. It's much appreciated.
Sure. So just to tell you, and very nice to meet you, Antoinette, by the way.
Same, the same.
Yes. So just to explain to you what this is a workshop walkthrough. It's not really the workshop. It's mainly a walkthrough of the exercises in the workshop. So most of this is sort of like pages from the workbook. And this is the initial workshop we take organizations through. So just to kind of align us, here's an important data point, I think, and it's just how change has changed. So if you go back to 1975, more than 80% of corporate assets, at least in the United States, were tangible assets. Fast forward to now, that has completely flipped, and most assets are intangible assets. So most of the assets in a corporation are no longer like plant, equipment, real estate. They tend to be things like processes, intellectual property, patents, so on and so forth. So that's important because when we talked about change, back in the early 80s, when the process of change management or the practice of change management first arose, it arose to address that first kind of change, where a strategic decision was made high up in the organization, and people could like it or not like it. But if the CEO decided you're going to build a factory, the factory's getting built. Doesn't matter really what you think about it, or to launch a new product line or whatever it is. But today, when we talk about change, we're talking about intangible assets, things people think and things they do. And people have an absolute ability to resist those types of things. I mean, if the CEO decides that everybody's going to do design thinking or I don't know, agile development or DEI or whatever it is, if the people resist, it's not going to happen. I mean, the CEOs just don't have that kind of power to change what people think and do every day, which is why we have this situation where McKinsey estimates 69% of transformations fail. IBM estimates 84%. Either way, it's absolutely horrible. I don't have the slide here, but I do use Centola for this. But the good news is that I do have it there. Your friend Damon Centola. The good news is that the tipping point is vanishingly small. Everett Rogers put the tipping point of 10 to 25% of a system. Erica Chenoweth, who researches revolutions, political revolutions, she puts the tipping point at 3.5% of a society. As you probably know, Damon Centola puts the tipping point at 25% of an organization. Either way, I mean, the point is, you don't need to convince everybody. You only need to convince a significant minority. And once your change gains traction, I mean, that's really the challenge, not 0 to 100, but like 0 to 25. And there's nothing to indicate that the tipping point is anywhere close to 51%. So what change looks like today, I often like to go through this. This is a great example from Experian. This was actually a successful transformation. But the CIO, a guy named Barry Leibinson, who's actually become a friend of mine, he had this idea that they were going to switch from, well, his first few months in the job as global CIO, he went around talking to all of Experian's customers. Most of them, of course, are big banks, but also they have important businesses in healthcare and autos and others. But they all came back with the same thing. And Experian, it's their main business is credit bureaus, but they work with other type of data. They all came back and they said that they wanted real-time access to data. So on the surface, it was just a simple business transformation from batch process credit to real-time access to data. But he, being a technology guy, he knew to undergo that business transformation, they would first have to undergo a technology transformation from on-premise to the cloud. But to make that transformation happen, they needed to undergo a skills-based transformation from waterfall to agile. So that what on the surface looks like a pretty straightforward business transformation is actually 3 transformations stacked on top of each other. And just to make things a little harder, what's going on here? People had reasons to hate all 3 of these transformations. For the business transformation, people were worried that they would lose control of the business model. They'd been making money in a certain way for a long, long time. And, it's not an unreasonable concern. The technology transformation, going to the cloud, people were concerned about cybersecurity. Again, given that while this transformation was underway, one of the Experian's key competitors had one of the largest data breaches of the decade. You remember this, Equifax? It made huge headlines. Happened while this transformation was underway. And then for the skills-based transformation, people said, I know my job. I take pride in the work I do as a project manager, and I don't want to be told that I've been doing it wrong all these years and I need to do it a different way. So there was any number of ways that this could go sideways. And I just want to stop here, Otti. And does this sound like a familiar scenario to you?
Yeah, all over, both in banking, being a accredited project and program manager. I know that side of it, and I was recently presenting the report on chief transformation officers that was done together with the Project and Program Management Association. So they got wind of that as well, and we're trying to move to agile program management. Yeah. And on the cybersecurity side as well. On the other hand, of course, also is very familiar Experian, which to a degree is a single service business, right? So there are also some idiosyncrasies in regards to this business and its business model that I think make this probably more or less comparable with some other cases.
Yeah, I mean, but in this case, because he approached it more like a social or political movement, and he put it right out front about how he was going to overcome these by focusing on people who actually empowering people who wanted it to happen rather than trying to convince people who don't. He was able to achieve it in under 3 years, and then he embarked on another one in with respect to AI. So this is actually a happy story. But what we see often is this process where the CEO gets an idea or somebody high up in the organization gets an idea for transformation. They tap some bright-eyed boy or girl, a high potential employee. They tell them they want you to, they want to go full steam ahead with this transformation. And that they have full board approval, they can have the budget they want, whatever they want, but they need this to happen. And then 6 months later, all of a sudden, that bright-eyed boy or girl realizes that this entire time they've been undermined by people who don't want this to happen, and it's stalled, and that executive sponsorship, which was ironclad, is now thinking maybe they picked the wrong person. And this initiative, which they thought was going to put their career into high gear, now threatens to derail it completely. And we see that.
Did they have a different mechanism? So did they go through a corporate voting mechanism? Did they have a democratic decision-making process or something to decide on the transformation?
Usually these are initiatives that come from the top, and if we say, okay, well, we want, let's say, agile development or whatever it is, and we want it to happen, so we're going to tap this person. They're going to be the leader of this initiative, and blah blah blah. And there's a big kickoff meeting and everything, but 6 months later, 6 to 12 months later, a lot of people I mean, there's a reason if your organization isn't an agile organization, there's a reason for that. I mean, if people wanted to adopt agile, they would have already adopted it. Now they feel.
No, I mean, sorry, Greg. What I meant was in Experian. Did they have a different process to reach the decision to move into the transformation?
No, he made this pretty much. No, this decision
was also top down in the decision making.
It was a top down decision, yeah. Which can work, but the way he approached it is he went and found people who wanted it to happen. He didn't mandate the change. And we can talk, I've even written articles about how he made this a success, but instead of telling people you want, essentially, and this oversimplifies it, instead of telling people, hey, you need to shift to the cloud. Well, first of all, he started with internal APIs, which mitigated the concerns about the security. But instead of focusing on convincing people that this was the right way to go, he focused on empowering people. They created an API center of excellence. They created training. So anybody who wanted to build cloud-based products, they got support and help. And as they became successful, it became much, much easier. Does that make sense? So he,
to a degree, I mean, that's
something we talk about a lot. I mean, you don't want to sell an idea. You want to get out of the business of selling an idea and into the business of selling a success. It's much easier to sell a success than it is to sell.
I think the big thing is to a degree. I mean, the question with this is the democratic element a success criteria? So should you open it up in decision making? I agree. Normally, that's not really what happens, or I don't even think what should happen. These are not necessarily decisions where everybody can contribute. Secondly, then in terms of empowering, yeah, okay, but that's to a degree old style, right? It's just board decides, we find a mechanism to get people's buy-in inverted commas.
Yeah, but change is never top down or bottom up. It's always side to side. You find resistance at every level of the, and we've seen it. I have another case study with Procter and Gamble, was a middle manager, guy in his 30s. He had this idea to do it himself. And now it's a movement of 50,000 people within Procter and Gamble. So
yeah, I think that's it. Will be interesting, because what I saw in the IT space clearly is, I mean, there's not a single IT developer, and here we're talking really technology-enabled transformation, right? So most of the developers I know, when it comes especially to programmers, they're all agile anyway. It's a grounds where everybody has the agile manifesto on the wall, so they want to do that, right?
There's you'd be surprised. There's still a lot of, and I sorry, I want to move on just because.
Let's go.
But you'd be surprised. Like it's funny. I was.
Sometimes it makes things easier, right? Even the French Works Council wasn't obstructing our move to agile because they actually liked it, because people had more say at the end, right? So this is one of the transformations where sometimes it's helpful.
There is still a lot of resistance to agile, as there is to design thinking, to any lean startup, any of this stuff, which has been around for decades and proves that it works. There's still a lot of barriers to adoption. Anyway, if this is chapter 3 and 4, I guess, in my book. This is the kind of the sort of version of it basically says the same thing that Damon Centola says, except I admit that I stole it from Duncan Watts. And it's the 3 principles of a cascade. So at the top, there's this famous experiment by Solomon Asch where they bring people in and they ask them which line on the right best matches the line on the left. And as they go around the room, the first 7 people all give the same wrong answer until they get to the last person. And the vast majority of the time, that person will conform to the majority opinion, even if it's obviously wrong. 7 people go and say that this, that it's this line A is most like the other one, and even if it's obviously wrong to that extent, people will tend to conform. So the point is, majorities don't just rule, they also influence. The best indicator of what we think and what we do are what the people around us think and do. The second principle comes from Mark Granovetter. It's called the threshold model of collective behavior. And basically what that means, and I'm running through this very fast. I actually take 2 chapters to explain it in the book. What that means is that we all have different thresholds of resistance to partake in an action or to adopt an idea. So Granovetter asks us to look at, to imagine people milling around in a town square somewhere. And at the top, you have that guy in red who's got 0 resistance. And he, so he just 0 resistance to, antisocial or violent behavior. So he's just a natural born troublemaker. He throws a rock through the window. The guy next to him, he's a little bit more reticent. And but he sees one guy going, so that's enough for him to join in. The guy next to him, he needs 2 people, so his threshold is met. And as you go around the circle, everybody's threshold is met, and a full-scale riot ensues. The example on the right is pretty much the same thing. You have the same troublemaker up top, his 2 buddies next to him, but after that, there's nobody with a low enough threshold to join in, and the thing just fizzles out. The point being, it makes a big difference where you start. If you start with people who are enthusiastic, it's going to be a lot easier to gain traction than if you start with people who are skeptical, which seems like common sense. But there's something about human nature. When we really believe strongly about something, we want to go convince the skeptics instead of empower people who actually, and that's essentially what they did at Experian, right? And what we tell people say, oh, Bobby and Susie, they're not going to like this. So don't tell Bobby and Susie, leave them alone, gain traction first, and then you can start trying to roll it out. The worst thing you can do is to start with a big kickoff meeting, because that just alerts the people who want to undermine your change that they better get started or it might actually happen. And then the strength of weak ties also comes from Mark Granovetter. The idea that that different clusters are connected to each other, and through those connections, different clusters can help them meet their resistance thresholds and can influence each other. And that's essentially how a cascade ensues. If you read Damon Centola, it's a very, very similar type of thing. Yeah.
And again, the social proof mechanism that stuck with us from Centola clearly comes through here as well. Yeah.
I mean, this is the problem. I stole this 100%, right? Except the small groups, loosely connected, united by a shared purpose, which is kind of a nice shorthand for it. That I invented. And Duncan liked that as well. And Duncan's a pretty surly character. Anyway, so that's kind of the theory. This is the actual framework that we take people through, take organizations through to. This is the second half of the book, where we're talking about actual practical steps and actions of how you empower change. So the first is defining a vision of tomorrow, what we call a keystone change, and genome of values. Then the planning, which is 2 tools taken from, essentially how you overthrow a country. Antoinette, you weren't here for our last discussion, but most of this stuff comes from my friend Srdja Popovic, who has built this kind of repeatable model for overthrowing a country. And that's where all of this stuff comes from. The thing, Spectrum of Allies and Pillars of Support, you can Google it, you'll see it all over. There's a bunch of different versions of it. They've been around for decades. And then execution, so platforms and tactics, weaving the network, and then finally surviving victory, which is the failure to survive victory is one of the most common things that happens. It's funny whenever I say it, everybody pretty much knows what I mean, right? And the reason why it happens is that, well, we'll go to it when we get there. So vision of tomorrow, this is the first thing we do, pretty standard, not really that much different than most workshops. What we find is when people come with change, an idea for change, they either come with a grievance or a vision, and they need the other. So they say, okay, we want agile development, but they aren't quite sure what the grievance is. They haven't identified the problem. And we see this all the time with innovation teams. It's one of the biggest. They want to go talk to everybody about innovation, but they're not clear on what problem they're actually solving, and nobody's clear on what problem. And that's why people tend to run away from innovation people at most organizations. But just as often, they come with a grievance that, oh, we need to do something because turnover is too high, or we're getting sued for diversity type of things or gender things, or they're very clear on the problem, but they haven't actually settled on a vision. And we find that about half the time it's one or the other. Does that jibe with your experience?
On Agile, totally. I mean, 90% of the people who ask me about implementing Agile, they haven't figured out why they want it.
Yeah, it's very common. So that's pretty straightforward. One of the things we tell people about a vision is a vision should never have a metric attached to it. It should always be aspirational, which is one of the things that makes the Keystone Change very effective. So when you have that vision, that's very, very aspirational, you need something to bridge that, from point A to point B, and that's what we call a keystone change. So a concrete keystone change has 3 criteria: a concrete and tangible goal, it involves multiple stakeholders, and it paves the way for future change. So here's some examples. Alcoa in the 80s, the focus was on workplace safety. When Paul O'Neill set out to turn Alcoa around, instead of saying we need to restore profitability or we need to regain operational excellence, he focused on workplace safety. And once he was able to achieve that, well, it's pretty hard to improve workplace safety and not implement operational excellence. At IBM, it was moving from a proprietary stack of technologies to customers' stack of business processes. Wyeth, this was an interesting one. This was a lean manufacturing one, and you'll read about it in the book, but they started with one process in one team in one factory, and they were able to roll it out to 18,000 employees within a year, and they cut costs by 20% without firing anybody. Experian, I already went through this a little bit, but the keystone change there was internal APIs. And at Procter & Gamble, they moved one key process from weeks down to hours. But the idea is you solve the problem one place in one, and when we're talking about keystone changes, we're always saying shrink it down, right? So can you transform one team, one office, one process, one something, so that you can get out of the business of selling an idea and into the business of selling a success? So this is the exercise. We always ask them to come up with multiple ideas for keystone changes, because it's usually kind of a trial and error type of thing to find one where you actually gain traction. What's important is that it's small enough, and your keystone change, only your enthusiasts are involved, people who want the change to work. So a failure won't really kill you, won't really hurt you, but a success gives you something to base the transformation on. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
My only question, Greg, is, and again, this is where I was trying to figure out how you had taken such kind of disparate use cases and merged them, where you were describing the Orange Revolution, because when you describe, what was it called? You had Occupy Wall Street, and then you had this other Otpur. The students.
Otpur.
There you go, Otpur. You said they were motivated mainly by getting rid of Milosevic, which for me was much higher. So of course it was a protest, but it was somehow related to much higher values rather than what you describe here as a precise, intangible, smart type of goal that can be implemented in the next years. That seemed to be radical social,
but getting rid of
political.
Milosevic was the keystone change. It wasn't the vision of tomorrow.
Okay.
That's what we screwed up in the Orange Revolution. We wanted to put, that's when we get into surviving victory. Your change can never be based on any particular person or technology or process or program, right? It always needs to be based on shared values. And you get to that later in the book. That's what we screwed up in the Orange Revolution. We thought if we changed the president, everything would change, but it didn't. We needed to actually have a vision for what we wanted the Ukrainian society to be. And that's why they were so much more successful in 2014, because it was based on values, not on putting this person in office, but on embracing European values. And you can see even today, that's what's held this country together. That's why they're winning. Anyway, I don't want to get too far down that road, but does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's exactly in that vein that I was asking the question. So interesting.
Yeah. Genome of values. So when we talk about values in a little different way, we say that if it doesn't involve a cost or constraint, it's not a value, it's a platitude. So we asked, what are the values of this initiative? And how does it, what's the purpose of this value? But then how does this value cost you? How does it constrain you? Because if it doesn't involve a cost or constraint, it's not something you value, it's something you say. And my favorite example is here. And it's amazing. You talk to anybody who was at IBM during the Gerstner revolution, they all talk about this. And I've asked people, and not one of them thought that IBM would still be in business without this. So the value was a customer focus. The idea was, and this was a phrase that Irving repeated to me many, many times. He said the idea was to bring IBM back into harmony with the market. And the cost was, Gerstner made it clear to everyone that he was willing to lose revenues on every sale. And and that's what made the whole thing credible. If you go into the history of IBM, you begin to understand why that was so important and powerful. But just for our purposes here, the fact that he wasn't just saying customer focus, that he was willing to incur costs, that's what made it all work. All clear so far? I mean, I want to move through quickly, but at the same time, I want to make sure I'm answering any questions. So these are the two planning tools, Spectrum of Allies and the Pillars of Support, which again, I stole. It's funny, I talk about my book like, you know, half of it I stole from Duncan Watts and half of it I stole from my friend Surja Otpur. My role really is Duncan doesn't know anything about Surja and Surja doesn't know anything about Duncan. But it's funny, I was doing a fact check thing with Duncan, and I don't know Duncan well, but we have spoken for many years at this point. And he said something like he was you might want to, he said, you might want to use this paper. He said, normally I would feel bad about pushing one of my papers on somebody, but seeing how you stole it all from me anyway. But he was nice. You can see he endorsed the book. So this is the Spectrum of Allies. And the idea is just like a general would want to map the terrain upon which the military battle is fought. You're going to want to map the terrain upon which the battle for change is being fought. So you want to identify who are your most active allies, who are your passive allies, who's neutral, who's passively opposed, and who's actively opposed. And these should be, you know, similar to marketing personas, not like, you know, Joe and Bob are with us, but Andy over there is a real prick or something like this. I mean, often they're like early adopters or very much like a marketing persona. So a couple of interesting things about the Spectrum of Allies. First of all, you pretty much never want to engage with your active opposition. And I mean, we discussed this last time. Anytime you set out to make significant impact, there's always going to be people who hate your idea and want to undermine it in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And usually they do it for reasons even they don't understand, because people have attachments and we're irrational, and anybody who's ever been married knows how, you know, what stupid things we can do. So that engagement isn't going to be an honest engagement, and it's going to be very unlikely to achieve anything than, you know, exhausting and frustrating you. And taking into account that the tipping point is, you know, at most 25%, you really don't need them anyway. But what you so the second point is that the way you move people from right to left on the Spectrum of Allies is through shared values. That's what actually moves people. If people believe you share their values, they'll be willing to look at your facts. If they don't believe that you share their values, they're not going to believe your facts, which is why it's so important. And we call it shifting from differentiating values to shared values. So let's go back to Agile, because, well, there's so much to make fun of there. But when you talk to an Agile person, and Otti, what's the first thing they want to tell you about?
Tribes and squads.
What? You already
Tribes
mentioned
and
it.
squads. Agile Manifesto.
Agile Manifesto, right? Because that's what makes them passionate. That's what they're passionate about. That's what they love. That generally speaking, when people want to advocate for something, they want to focus on what differentiates this idea, differentiating values. But the way you bring people in is shared values, better projects, done faster and cheaper. I mean, who could argue with that? But when somebody wants to advocate for Agile, they tend to start with the Agile Manifesto, which seems completely crazy often to anybody outside the Agile community. Does that jibe with your experience?
What, the Agile Manifesto being crazy to someone outside, or?
Yeah, when somebody comes back from an Agile workshop and they're talking about the Agile, I mean, a lot of people think it's a bit strange.
Yeah, no, you think those people are strange, but sometimes you thought that even before they left for the workshop. But
No, we saw the same thing in LGBTQ, where for decades they were getting hammered with family values and they were accentuating difference. We're here, we're queer, we want to be accepted for our difference. And they were getting hammered by family values and defense of marriage and all this. How did they win? We want to live in committed relationships. We want to raise happy and healthy families. And that's how we can really use the active opposition. Because if we listen to them, we not engage, but actually listen to them, we can find out, we can identify flaws that we genuinely need to fix. But B, we can identify shared values. If we can identify a shared value in what they're saying, then that is a very, very powerful thing. It won't convince them, but it will be effective with people who are more closer to the middle. This is almost like a Jedi mind trick type of thing when we do it in workshops, or just even in conversations. When you're trying to look at how to sell it, you say, well, how do the people who oppose it, the people who hate the idea, what do they say? And if you can find an underlying value in that, you usually find something pretty effective. So that's the first one, spectrum of allies. The pillars of support is, how we explain it, we ask people to think of like an all-powerful dictator somewhere, like, Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un or something like this. And then imagine all the janitors decide not to come into work one day. Well, that all-powerful dictator is powerless to get trash picked up. Point being is that the only thing that makes an all-powerful dictator important or powerful is their control of institutions. If you want to actually create change, you need to influence institutions that can actually make change happen. And Occupy is a great example of how not to do this. Remember, they didn't want to have anything to do with institutions. How are you going to actually make stuff happen? So in the example on the left, where it's a political change, you have typical pillars would be things like the military, the police, the media, business leaders, organized religion. If you can influence those pillars, you can make a lot of change in a society. In the other two were actually taken from workshops. In one, it was the unions, media. Media is actually almost always a decent target. Unions, media, suppliers, shareholders, and customer groups. The other one was investors and analysts, regulatory agencies, industry associations. Universities is very often an important one for technologies, by the way. And you'll see like Google, IBM, Microsoft, they all have enormous university programs. Division heads, professional groups. And so here's how, well, that's essentially the exercise. But the point is, let me go, okay. Anyway, the point of this exercise, we always want to be mobilizing people in the spectrum of allies to influence institutions in the pillars of support. So you're always mobilizing somebody to influence something. And those are the two questions you want to ask. Who are we mobilizing, and to influence what? Then, just to show you how this works, then we go through and we rate the pillars in terms of approachability. So these are, again, which of these are kind of resistant and which are supporters. And then also their importance, which of these pillars are influential and which of them are not. We plot this on a pillar analysis plot, And then when we go into activating the plan, you'll see the importance of this. So activating the plan, designing tactics. Here's that part about we're always mobilizing those constituencies in the spectrum of allies to influence institutions in the pillars of support. And here's how we do that once we're able to segment those institutions. So in the upper right hand corner, you have institutions that are both influential and they're also supportive, and those are your leaders. In the lower right, and you want to leverage that influence. In the lower right, you have institutions that are supportive, but maybe not so influential. So let's say in the upper right, it could be the HR organization is very much on board. So that's somebody you would actively collaborate with. But in the lower right, it might be like an industry association, which is very much on board with this change, but doesn't have a whole lot of influence. But they do have resources, right? So maybe you can get a keynote at the annual conference or whatever. So you can collaborate them in a very different way. On the ones on the upper left, those are the blockers. Those are institutions that have high influence, but lower level of support. And you want to leverage shared values to at least bring them into an area of neutrality. They don't need to be 100% on board, but hopefully they're not blocking you. And then on the lower left, you have the holdouts. And then you just kind of want to address their fears so they're not bomb throwing. I know that's a lot of analysis in a short amount of time, but
that's a typical stakeholder map. So yeah, clear.
Right, but it's a little bit different in that there's two types of stakeholders. There's the spectrum of allies, and those are targets for mobilization. And there's the pillars of support, and those are targets for influence. So here's some practical examples taken from the book. So at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, these are all things you have to look forward to in the second half of the book. They created something called change kits that were something that could be implemented at hospitals. And they use these change kits to mobilize the doctors, nurses, and even orderlies on the floor to actually implement these practices. And in doing that, they were able to influence the hospitals and the insurance companies on an institutional level. And this was famously effective. NHS, the Change Day, this was, they were mobilizing frontline staff. And essentially what they did is they asked them to, they just asked people to make one change that would improve the lives of patients. And the first year, I think they had 700,000. And then by the second year, they had 1.4 million. So they were mobilizing the frontline staff, but they were influencing both the administrators and the patient advocates, because administrators, they saw, wow, people actually are willing to do these changes. And some of them were quite effective and had an impact. And some of them were things that were kind of sitting around for some years and just gave people the opportunity to advocate for them. And also patient advocates, which are external institutions, were also influenced by a lot of these innovations that came to light through the Change Day. At Wyeth, it was the tactic was workshops, and they were mobilizing the frontline factory workers, and that helped them influence the middle management. So I know that's they're explained in better depth in the book, of course. But does that make sense so far?
I mean, Antoinette is nodding. I think my only question is, Greg, you said the difference to a normal stakeholder map is that you more cleanly separate between who you mobilize and who you influence. But based on the previous 2x2, it seems that the people with high influence you use to influence, the people with lower influence use to mobilize. But in reality, if people have resources and they are leaders in your top right quadrant, you would also use their resources and therefore mobilize, I guess. So what is the qualifying difference in mobilizing or influencing in your mind then?
So mobilizing are people. It's so for instance, the frontline staff, right, in the NHS example, they don't actually have any power to enact change.
Yeah, so if they're in the high in influencing, that would be the who you can influence. If they're low in influence,
power. So like, so like an industry association, that would be certainly an institution, but it might not be so influential. But it gets a little bit complicated because, you know, if you're talking about let's say, the CHRO, so like certain, like the CFO, for instance, in a company is a person, but that person actually wields institutional power. And that's the difference.
Not clear. I mean, so as you had in the previous slide, if they have a lot of influence in their institutional role, that
did
would
I
clearly
go dark?
be...
Oh, sorry, you went out there for a second. So you're making the distinction between, for instance, right? Let's say the human resource head of human resources. She might not like this change, but if generally people in the company do, that's going to influence her. So when you mobilize people in mass, that's a mobilization. That's like getting people excited. That's like change, you know, but so the point is that there's no, generally speaking, it's not effective just to do mobilization. If everybody's excited, everybody loves agile or lean startup or design thinking, who cares? Unless the institutional power, like unless the technology department, you know, the IT organization supports this as an organization, it doesn't matter whether people like it or they don't. At the same time, if Barry at Experian as CIO, if he just made this decision, we're switching to the cloud, that wouldn't have been, he had 100% institutional authority to do that, but it wouldn't have been successful if he didn't actually take the efforts to mobilize people behind it. Does that make more sense?
So yeah, and I think, Antoinette, it's similar to our separation between institution and practice. I think for us, Greg, the biggest question is, whoever your friend was in Experian, was it the right decision? So we're not into the how do you influence people. We're more into the how do you actually get to the right decision at the start, and what's the mechanism? Is it one person taking the decision, multiple people, on what basis? So I think
right, and we're the opposite. So how we're building
exactly. So and this is, I think, the nice linkage. So what we are listening to at your discussion is exactly this mechanism. So if we get the institution, so to speak, to take the right decisions, how do we generate that cascade?
How do you actually scale that? Yeah, it's a very different question. How do you
scale that? And I think, on the other hand, like you just point out, assuming that very often it's the frontline staff, taking the NHS in the middle, who contingently in the local, in the small local team, they have the knowledge to take the right decision, but the people in the back end sitting in the headquarters don't. what's that mechanism by which the influencing makes sure that the right decision at the institutional level is taken over time and then cascaded through and scaled, like you said. So what is the interaction between the two?
Right. Like you can mobilize people for a hackathon, but if you're not actually influencing, then just, and that happens all the time. And I think the NHS example's so important because some of the ideas, I'm trying to remember exactly what they were. One was like it was procedures to avoid problems with septic stuff, right? Infections going bad. And there had been this whatever program to solve like this technique that had been around. And nobody really, it hadn't really caught on. But because of Change Day, this woman got to advocate for it. And that's how it got institutional traction. But thinking of both those things, how do you mobilize people and get them excited about it? You can get people to the hackathon, but unless you're actually influencing an institution or somebody with institutional power, you're just wasting your time. But yeah, ChangeOS is designed to honor somebody else's idea. It's fairly idea neutral.
So Greg, is there like a tipping point then? So if you take your allies that you mobilize, you want them to effectively get the influencers then on their side. Is there a tipping point when you would persuade them to exert their influence to support what's being mobilized? That makes sense?
Yeah, so it's all tied up with the Keystone Change.
Yeah.
So you remember the Keystone Change comes first. So at Experian, they started with this internal APIs, and which was much safer, right? And scaled down and all of those things. They started having some success with that. They got together a bunch of young product managers and got them agile training, created something we're going to talk about in a second called a co-optable resource of an API center of excellence, which is really just kind of like an internal consulting thing. And a phrase that gets used a lot. I can send you this HBR article that explains this, but the phrase that gets used a lot, like something that will help them solve their problems for free. So once these product managers started becoming successful and started building some products that were doing well and becoming profitable, that's how you're able to get institutional traction. That's when you can and start thinking about what those institutions are. That's when you can start going to major customers. That's when you can start going to regulatory agencies. That's when you can start going to vendors. So your that mobilization makes that influence campaign possible. Does that make sense? Now we're talking about weaving the network and co-optability. It's one of my favorite strategies. And I use the example of TEDx because it's such a fantastic example. But think about TEDx for a second. I mean, one of the toughest things about change is we need to allow people to embrace it for their own reasons, which are often different than ours. And I'm amazed how often people sabotage their own change, because it's not just enough that that people embrace the change. They want people to embrace the change for the reasons that they want them to embrace the change, if you know what I mean. But think about TEDx, right? The TED conference has thousands of people around the world spending millions of man hours, probably billions of dollars in resources to promote the TED conference, but they're not doing it for TED, they're doing it for their own reasons. And that's the idea of a co-optable resource. If you can give somebody something, if you can give them a mobile app or you can give them, I don't know, a code base, whatever it is. It can take almost any form where they can co-opt this idea for their own reasons. And Experian is, was a great one. The co-optable resource was the API Center of Excellence. He didn't say, I want you to do this because, the cloud's important. He said, I'm going to give you resources so that you can build the types of products that you want to build. Anyway, so this is the exercise we do. We look at existing platforms, additional platforms, how we can create resources that people can co-opt for their own reasons. And how can we also use this platform to help people connect, share, and reinforce each other. And then surviving victory. One of the most interesting things I found, and it's my favorite chapter in the book, is that the victory phase is often the most dangerous phase. And one of the big problems that people have is they think that once they get that first initial win, once they get their program budgeted or get executive sponsorship or whatever it is, everything is going to go, everything is going to get easier after that, when actually it almost always gets harder. Have you ever noticed that, Otti?
I can imagine, frankly.
Yeah.
If the victory is the decision point, yeah, that's where the trouble starts.
Right. And think about why that happens. The example I love to give is because everybody's had this experience when somebody, when you're in a meeting and it's slowly heading towards a consensus. And then finally, at the end of the meeting, somebody who hadn't said anything the entire time, as you're sort of going to next steps, somebody who hadn't said anything the entire time throws a hissy fit in the middle of the conference room and completely discredits themselves. Have you ever seen that happen? Or no? Because if you haven't seen it happen, you're going to be the first one. Sorry, I didn't.
No, I'm sure this happens.
Yeah.
You will not sure I would talk to those people again afterwards, but
right. But think about why that happens. They were dead set against this idea, and they were sure it would fail. But once they see that it's possible, it's not that people start resisting in spite of that initial win. They're resisting because of that initial win. Because that initial win actually makes this change. They don't, and remember, these are people who have some sort of attachment that makes them want to undermine this change in ways that are, dishonest and underhanded and deceptive.
Sounds so like when Brexit, they see Greg.
What's this?
Sounds like Brexit, when lots of people who never expected it to happen started Googling what the EU was the day after the referendum.
Right.
Fuck, we're in the shit now.
Go ahead.
So you're pushing people from a passive to an active resistance once they realize it's actually going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's actually, what's amazing about it, and I just wrote another blog post about this. What's amazing about it is it's the opposite of what people expect. They think, oh, I just got my program budgeted. Oh, I just had this win. Now everybody will see that the change is inevitable and they'll embrace it. And the exact opposite happens. And that is the most common point at which change gets derailed. Yeah. I mean, we've all seen that happen. Yeah. So what do we do about that? We talk about how to identify 3 to 5 vulnerabilities that would put it at risk. So think, once you, so much of it is anticipation. Once you know that's going to happen, once you know, hey, we got our budget, the knives are going to come out. So where are we going to be vulnerable? What strategies can we use to mitigate those risks? And how can we reassert those shared values that we identified in the Spectrum of Allies exercise to address those attacks? And That's pretty much the workshop. I know it's a lot to go through in a very short period of time, but we actually almost got through it in an hour. An hour
We
and
did it.
8 minutes or whatever.
It's quite interesting how you picked some of the most prolific findings of social science and use it along the way. So I like it. I mean, for instance, you take social identity theory and take their very powerful finding that you just have to both look at Kandinsky, and so you win the others over. So that's quite nice. And you still are quite, I mean, just using some of these along the way.
Well, I got to tell you, I don't really know that much about social theory. I stole all of this stuff from either Duncan Watts on the network side or Serja. I don't know whether Otti, the genesis of this was that I was involved in the Orange Revolution and wanted to find out what happened. And then that's what led me to my friend Serja, who built this repeatable model for overthrowing a country. And the Cascades research was really trying to see if you can validate the idea that we can, you know, because my background is running organizations. So it seemed to me that it would be effective in organizations. And then Cascades was validating that. And it's funny because in many ways that Serja himself never saw. He's got this really interesting idea about a dilemma action, which is actually getting an increasing academic interest. And the idea behind a dilemma action is you create the situation. And it's interesting if you actually look at social movements or political revolutions over time, change really doesn't happen because people are convinced. If you look at any big change, it almost always happens when the people who oppose it discredit themselves in some way. So if you know Gandhi and the Salt March is a great example, or in the civil rights movement, Bull Connor and letting the fire hoses and the dogs. But what Serja did, he actually codified how to design one, that you start off with a shared value and you design a constructive act which forces an action, right? If you're familiar with Gandhi and the Salt March, the British either had to let him make salt, or they had to or they had to stop him. There's only one of two things that either one wouldn't turn out well for them. If they just let Gandhi go forward, then their authority would be undermined. If they stopped him from, boiling water, seawater, it also looks ridiculous. And that's very effective in an organization. I've actually had things like that. There was one time I actually wrote about this, that I had a sales director who she was supposed to give up all her accounts and she was refusing to. She didn't actually refuse. She was just sandbagging me and kind of slow walking it. Otti, I'm sure with your experience in transformation, you've had that happen a number of times, yes? Anyway, so what I did was and this is going to be, dilemma actions are going to be part of ChangeOS. But what I did was I set up an appointment. I talked to one of the company's customer CEOs, and I set up an appointment with one of the salespeople and one of the buyers, which she was supposed to do but never did. And once I did that, she could only do one of two things. She could let the meeting go forward, or she could try to sabotage it. And once she did, and she tried to sabotage it, and that, And that was a fireable offense, and that solved the problem.
So she became discredited.
Mhm.
She discredited herself. Yeah. It's one of the most, but from a corporate or organizational, and we talk about this a lot when we're helping ongoing things. You don't create a conflict, you create a dilemma.
Mhm.
And
Anyway,
to some extent, the discrediting is because it is against really the bigger purpose of whatever the organization or company is. So in a sales scenario, if she's sabotaging a sale, it can only be wrong and bad and therefore discrediting.
Yeah, that's where they're discrediting themselves because it's based in a shared value.
Yeah, but it's anti the value that really has the consensus of the rest of the organization.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you have a shared value and you have a constructive act,
yeah,
then the only thing is they either need to let that act go forward or they need to break that value.
yeah.
And once you actually look at it, and we have design principles, but those are the basic design principles. There's some other things as well, but that's it in a nutshell. But once you do that, it's such a powerful thing.
So do you teach people how to do this? So they set tripwires all over the business then to discredit anyone that's going to disagree?
100%. No, we talk about that a lot. You know, anytime change isn't about persuasion. Anytime you feel the need to persuade, you either have the wrong idea or the wrong people. If you're going to be successful, you should be, you make change by empowering people to make it successful, so that they can bring in other people who can bring in others still. But when you do that, you're going to encounter this resistance, and you're going to have to figure a way how to overcome that resistance. There's different ways. We talk, one of them is good for a meeting actually, but you can set up an internal red team. And this is not the irrational resistance. This is the more constructive, skeptical resistance, where you set up and you say, hey, I know you're skeptical about this. You be our red team. You keep us honest. You tell us about what you think isn't working. And then you give them that constructive role. That can work. And that can actually be very, very successful. If you're able to find the right type of person to run that, they can actually end up being big advocates. But they're the rational, skeptical opponents. They're not the irrational. And usually the irrational opponents, they don't voice their objections. They just try and sabotage you quietly. The second one, when you're gaining, when they see you gaining traction, they will almost always lash out. So another thing you can do is just kind of wait for it and try and be prepared for it. But then if you've actually identified who the people are, then you can do a dilemma action. Anyway, what do we think? Interesting, helpful, wonderful, revolutionary?
I think
Brilliant.
interesting for, of course, all of the above, Greg. And thank you again very much for making the time. I think we'll be happy to what's the right word? To exchange the favor once we've got our framework nailed. Whereas I have to warn you that we are deep in the theory. So this is you've nicely rounded it.
The corporate version of virtue ethics. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So it's gonna be
very far away from the corporate version. I can tell
very
you right
far
now.
away from corporate and pragmatism and a nice kind of sequence of things. But that said, I mean, happy to give you the same insight at some stage. And then you will see what our thinking is whilst we see that. One, the packaging, so to speak, right? Nicely encapsulated in a number of phases where there's internal coherence of the different pieces. To a degree traditional, right? Vision, strategy, execution, getting buy-in, and then maintaining it, right? So that's the typical way that you would cascade it, as the name says. you're bringing in some elements of the network theory. And again, here, I think we need to follow up a little bit on our side to go into that. Okay, how do you create social proof? So if it's not the institution going in the right way, and then you're just helping the institution to influence the people to come along, what's about creating change where the institution is not on your side, and actually maybe not even the people who are executing, right? Because that's a little bit where we are coming from. Everybody is on an ideological neoliberal capitalism, and we want to convince people of virtue ethics. So how do we create the vehicles to bring some of the people, but also change some of the institutions in such a way that we can create that shift, right? So the question for us is almost a meta question. How can we use some of your logic to actually create a new story that if I go to a CEO tomorrow, he might read it in the way that you read it, so to speak, or that you offer it. Here's a story to make you more highly performant, but in reality, from our perspective, the story is, how do we create a more ethical organization where performance for us is the last thing that we're interested in, and even cascading people's influence we're not really interested in unless it's the right thing. I'm not sure if I'm getting my message.
I mean,
you know what I mean?
Like, I think we talked about Andrew Winston and Paul Pullman.
And
this
exactly.
type of stuff. You know, I think you really need a keystone change, right? I mean, that's a good place to start, and you need your initial enthusiasts, because again, I think that the feeling that you need to persuade is a tripwire. Once you feel like you need to persuade this person, the CEO that you're talking to, you've got the wrong person, right? I mean, what you really need is you want a CEO who wants it to happen and that you can help him. Because if you have to
the only challenge is, and again, I think this is where everything that you say makes total sense. Where our thinking at the moment is that where we are starting from is a philosophical logic, right? So what we want to change is not what people do, but the reason they do it. And that's not simply changing value one for value two, but it's actually changing the way they think about the world. So it's like one level removed. Before you figure out your keystone change, you have to figure out, why is that actually relevant?
The vision of tomorrow.
Yeah, the vision of tomorrow, but what is my vision of tomorrow predicated upon?
Right.
What are the values? What is my view of human beings? What does success mean? Is that material success? Immaterial success? What's the good life? Before I answer that question, any keystone will just perpetuate the existing system.
There's one thing I can tell you that might be helpful, and it's a story. It's encapsulated in a story I love to tell, but I remember after the Orange Revolution, there was an interview with Viktor Pinchuk, who was very much a part of the former regime. He was not only an oligarch and a member of parliament, he was actually President Kuchma's son-in-law. So you can't find a more regime guy than him. And he was asked what he thought about the protests, on the Maidan, in the Orange Revolution. And you know what he said? He said, well, I was nervous. They made me nervous because my kids were down there. And you wouldn't believe how influential that is. Sir John was able to get to police that way. Everybody lives in a neighborhood. Everybody goes to, has family, institutions, places of worship, whatever. And that is so incredibly influential. You wouldn't believe the number of changes that get made because somebody couldn't face their grandkids.
This is the keystone, but it's an individual keystone where they relate powerfully to it. So Otti's talking about effectively finding, told Otti to find the keystone, but it's finding keystones that are common to individuals to make an individual change to influence.
Right, I'm not talking about a keystone change. I'm talking about people's motivation for change.
Yeah.
It's almost like shame, right? Be ashamed of the type of world that you're leaving for your kids, right? So that's why someone suggested philosophy is preparation for death. It's kind of, what do you want to be remembered once you're dead? What do you want to be remembered for when you die? Right? Is what you're doing really standing the test of what is good in this world? And I think,
it's also why the education pillar is often so important, especially like in Iran now, where they really have a pillar problem. But one of the places that they've gained traction are education pillars. And if change does come to Iran, I guarantee you it's going to be because of, people worried about their kids, their grandkids, their spouse, their people. It's one of the most interesting aspects of change, because when we think of a leader of this institution or this organization or this, we often forget that they live in the world, and there's ways to get to anybody.
Very good. I think that's Antoinette. This links almost to the question about our introduction to a degree that we had this morning.
All the time, But
what is the motivation?
Yeah, but shame and death, I'm not so sure, Otti. I think we could frame
legacy.
a little bit more hopeful. Yeah, I think so.
Legacy. Yeah, I think the legacy is the piece.
Yeah.
But I think that it might depend a little bit, but again, when we were talking about, even with John, sorry, there's another guy, we were talking about global warming and so on, and why some people are willing to jump on the train of responsible organizations, leadership, carbon dioxide reduction, and so on. Very often, as Greg said, is because they think about their grandchildren and they see them and they feel that what they're doing isn't right. Right? So I agree with you, Greg. That's a powerful motivator.
People live in the world. And it's interesting. Joseph Borrell just made a similar speech, and I wrote something about it. But identity is a very, very powerful thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that in the two chapters or 3 chapters I read of your book, and you make that point at some stage, Greg. You say this wasn't about whatever the values or something. This was about identity. And I think that is exactly where Antoinette and I are coming from, right? Virtue ethics is about your character. That's about who you are. It's not about what goals you have, what program you run, how good your actions are. It's about who you are. And I think this is a point that we must not lose sense of.
What do you want to be? And that's
why you want to become.
Legacy is so a very strong feature here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I think, Greg, we're probably over time, but so you've made us again beautifully think. One, because you've got such a nice and coherent exposition. We're so far away from that, and it shows again a little bit where we have to get to in something similar. Even if our story is almost before your story.
Oh yeah, definitely.
We're kind of coming to the why should you act at all, and then once you've defined why you should act, then you need to figure out how to do it, and that's where your cascades come in. So it's almost the back end of our story, and we need to create the front end. But like you say, some of the rationale from the front end needs to support the cascade, otherwise it's lost.
Right.
So we need to figure this out.
You're about how to climb up the mountain. I'm about how to get down the other side without killing yourself.
That's such a nice metaphor, and it feels like the freaking climb up. I can tell you, it's like
I hope you'll consider me a resource and let me know any way I can help.
If you're willing, that would be brilliant. Our plan at the moment is, and Tim, I didn't tell you. I think I told you last time. We're developing the second version of our theory, and then we are planning in December to invite some people who might be interested or willing to come on a call for an hour to actually give some feedback. where I think our video for the first version will be really, really problematic and probably long. So we're going to send that out beforehand. And then if people can watch that, then afterwards, if they're still willing to come on a call with us, we will ask for some feedback.
You're going to send out the video that we recorded last time, or is this a different video?
We want to read, no, this is a video we're working on for the next version of our theory for the book that's going to come out in 2076.
Okay.
By the way, before we finish, Tim, just wondering, because I mean, you're obviously a digital transformation guy. Any would be interested in any of your impressions on
this?
Talk about.
Oh well, I think it's fantastic. Let's stop there.
Well,
it's an eloquent model that you've managed to distill things down and to enable change through an organization, to see key points, key players, how to influence, how to get there. And it's also very interesting in the context of what Otti and Antoinette are doing as well.
I think it is.
What they're trying to do beforehand. So they're looking at the motivation for good. And I think part of that is the definition of what good actually is. That's what you've been battling with philosophically. And you've provided...
I'm also trying to make good sexy. And I think here we are meeting then in the end. So
again, Greg, I think you say that in your somewhere, right? You say it's about making change sexy. And yeah, we're trying to make morality sexy. That's really like making the Pope sexy, so to speak. And that's a totally wrong metaphor.
I think that's as good a place as any to stop. So enjoy your week. You guys don't have Thanksgiving, but you can still eat turkey.
Greg, again, big thank you.
Enjoy your turkey.
Thank you very much.
Love it. Thank you.
Take good care.